The presidential palace in Ouagadougou had never seen a leader quite like Ibrahim Traoré. While previous presidents surrounded themselves with expensive furniture and luxury items, Ibrahim kept his office simple and functional. He removed portraits of former colonial administrators and replaced them with images of African independence heroes like Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, and Kwame Nkrumah. These changes symbolized a fundamental shift in how Burkina Faso saw itself and its place in the world. Ibrahim's daily routine shocked the political establishment. Instead of long meetings with foreign ambassadors and international business leaders, he spent his time visiting military bases, rural communities, and development projects. He would arrive unannounced at army barracks to check on soldier morale and equipment. He visited villages affected by terrorism to hear directly from survivors about their needs and experiences. The transformation of Burkina Faso's military became Ibrahim's top priority. He understood that without security, no other development was possible. Traditional military hierarchies were restructured to promote officers based on battlefield performance, rather than political connections. Soldiers who had distinguished themselves fighting terrorists were given leadership positions, while those who had failed in combat were reassigned or removed. Ibrahim personally oversaw the development of new military tactics adapted to the Sahel environment. Instead of relying on heavy vehicles and conventional formations that made easy targets for guerrilla fighters, Burkinabe forces began using lighter, more mobile units that could respond quickly to intelligence reports. Local knowledge became valued more than foreign military manuals. The results were dramatic. Within months of Ibrahim taking power, Burkina Faso's military began achieving significant victories against terrorist groups. Villages that had been abandoned for years were reclaimed and secured. Displaced families started returning to their homes as government forces established control over previously contested areas. The transformation amazed international observers who had written off the country as a lost cause. Ibrahim's success in the security sphere gave him credibility to pursue broader reforms. He launched investigations into corruption that had plagued previous governments, recovering millions of dollars that had been stolen from public funds. Former officials who had enriched themselves while the country struggled were arrested and prosecuted. The message was clear. The era of impunity for corrupt elites was over. Economic policy underwent equally dramatic changes. Ibrahim canceled contracts with foreign companies that were extracting Burkina Faso's gold and other minerals, while leaving little benefit for local communities. New agreements were negotiated that required foreign investors to share profits more equitably and to hire and train local workers. The goal was to ensure that Burkina Faso's natural wealth benefited its own people first. Education and healthcare received unprecedented attention and funding. Ibrahim understood that long-term development required investing in human capital. Schools that had been closed due to security concerns were reopened under military protection. New healthcare clinics were built in rural areas that had never had access to modern medical services. These initiatives were funded through recovered stolen assets and better management of mineral revenues. The international response to Ibrahim's reforms was mixed but increasingly hostile from traditional partners. France imposed economic sanctions and worked to isolate Burkina Faso diplomatically. The United States suspended military aid and threatened additional penalties. International financial institutions warned about the consequences of abandoning established economic partnerships. However, Ibrahim found new allies who shared his vision of African independence. Russia began providing military equipment and training that was more effective than Western alternatives. China offered infrastructure development projects without the political conditions typically imposed by Western donors. Other African countries, particularly those with similar experiences of foreign exploitation, expressed solidarity with Burkina Faso's new direction. The most dramatic moment came when Ibrahim addressed the United Nations General Assembly in New York. Speaking in simple, clear language, he explained why African countries had the right to choose their own partners and determine their own development paths. His speech was broadcast live across Africa, inspiring millions of young people who had never heard their continent's interests defended so boldly on the world stage. Ibrahim's words resonated far beyond Burkina Faso. Social media platforms, filled with videos of young Africans expressing support for his message of self-determination and dignity, University students across the continent organized rallies demanding that their own governments adopt similar policies of independence and self-reliance. The movement was spreading beyond what any single country could contain. Back home, Ibrahim's popularity reached unprecedented levels. Public opinion surveys showed approval ratings above 90%, driven by tangible improvements in security and governance. Even critics acknowledged that his government had achieved more in its first year than previous administrations had accomplished in decades. The combination of effective leadership and popular support created a powerful foundation for continuing reforms. However, Ibrahim knew that success brought new challenges. Foreign powers that had lost influence in Burkina Faso were working actively to destabilize his government. Intelligence reports suggested that external actors were funding opposition groups and spreading disinformation about his policies. The young leader understood that his revolution's survival depended on maintaining both military strength and popular support while building alliances with other African countries that shared his vision of continental independence. The conference room in Bamako, Mali, was filled with an electric atmosphere as Ibrahim Traoré sat alongside his counterparts from Mali and Guinea. The three young military leaders, all products of recent coups in their respective countries, were meeting to coordinate their vision for West African independence. The meeting represented something unprecedented in modern African politics, military leaders choosing cooperation over competition in their quest for genuine sovereignty. Ibrahim had traveled to Mali despite international pressure to isolate the military governments in the region. Western powers had hoped that sanctions and diplomatic isolation would force these leaders to abandon their independent policies and return to the established order. Instead, the pressure was pushing them closer together, creating a bloc of African countries committed to charting their own course in international affairs. The agenda for the meeting was ambitious. The three leaders discussed coordinating their military efforts against terrorist groups that operated across borders in the Sahel region. They planned joint operations that would allow their forces to pursue enemies into neighboring countries, without the bureaucratic delays that had previously hampered counterterrorism efforts. This practical cooperation was already showing results, with terrorist groups finding it harder to escape across national boundaries. Economic cooperation was equally important. The three countries began developing trade agreements that would reduce their dependence on former colonial powers. Burkina Faso's gold could be processed in Mali's refineries, while Guinea's bauxite could be transported through Burkina Bay territory. These arrangements kept more wealth within Africa, while creating jobs and development opportunities that benefited local communities. Ibrahim's influence extended beyond formal government meetings. Young people across West Africa were adopting his speeches and ideas as inspiration for their own activism. University students in Senegal, Ivory Coast, and Ghana organized rallies demanding that their governments adopt more independent foreign policies. The movement was becoming larger than any single leader or country could control. Social media amplified Ibrahim's message across the continent. Videos of his speeches were shared millions of times, translated into dozens of African languages. Young Africans who had never heard their continent's interests articulated so clearly began to see themselves as part of a larger struggle for dignity and independence. The psychological impact was as important as any policy change. The response from established powers grew increasingly desperate. France began organizing opposition groups in countries with military governments, providing funding and training for protests designed to destabilize the new leadership. International media campaigns portrayed Ibrahim and his allies as dictators who were leading their countries toward chaos and isolation. However, these efforts largely backfired. The more foreign powers attacked Ibrahim, the more popular he became among ordinary Africans who had experienced decades of exploitation under supposedly democratic governments. People could see the improvements in security, economic management, and national pride that his leadership had brought to Burkina Faso. They wanted similar changes in their own countries. Ibrahim's personal style continued to set him apart from typical political leaders. He maintained his simple lifestyle, living modestly and focusing on practical results rather than ceremonial privileges. When he traveled to other countries, he stayed in ordinary hotels rather than luxury accommodations, He ate local food and spoke directly with common people rather than confining himself to diplomatic receptions. This authenticity resonated powerfully with African audiences who were tired of leaders who enriched themselves while their people suffered. Ibrahim represented a new type of leadership that prioritized national development over personal wealth. His example inspired other young Africans to consider careers in public service and military leadership. The economic results of Ibrahim's policies were becoming undeniable. Burkina Faso's GDP growth accelerated as more mineral wealth stayed in the country and corruption decreased. Healthcare and education systems improved with increased funding and better management. Infrastructure projects that had stalled for years under previous governments were completed efficiently and on budget. International credit rating agencies, despite political pressure to downgrade Burkina Faso, were forced to acknowledge the country's improved financial management. Foreign investors who had initially fled because of sanctions began quietly returning, recognizing that Ibrahim's government offered more stability and better business conditions than its predecessors. The military transformation was even more impressive. Burkina Faso's armed forces had evolved from a demoralized institution that struggled against terrorist groups to a confident military that was winning decisive victories. Other African countries began requesting training and assistance from Burkinabe. Officers who had developed effective counterinsurgency techniques adapted to local conditions. Ibrahim used these successes to build broader coalitions across Africa. He established communication with leaders in East and Southern Africa, who shared his commitment to continental unity and independence. The vision was expanding beyond West Africa to encompass the entire continent, creating networks of cooperation that bypassed traditional colonial relationships. The young leader understood that his revolution's long-term success required institutionalizing the changes he had initiated. Military governments are temporary by nature, but the transformation of African consciousness that Ibrahim was leading needed to outlast any individual leader. He began developing educational programs and institutional reforms that would ensure future generations would maintain the spirit of independence and self-reliance that defined his leadership. The military barracks in Ouagadougou buzzed with tension in early 2022. Captain Ibrahim Traoré moved quietly through the corridors, his mind focused on the dangerous mission ahead. At just 34 years old, he had already earned a reputation as one of Burkina Faso's most capable military officers. His fellow soldiers respected his tactical brilliance and unwavering commitment to protecting civilians from terrorist attacks. Burkina Faso was bleeding. Every week brought news of another village attacked, more innocent people killed, and families forced to flee their homes. The jihadist insurgency that had started in neighboring Mali was spreading like wildfire across the Sahel region. President Roch Kabore's government seemed paralyzed, unable to develop an effective strategy to counter the growing threat. Ibrahim had spent months in the field, leading operations against terrorist groups in the country's northern regions. He witnessed firsthand the devastation these attacks caused to rural communities. Entire villages were reduced to ashes, schools were destroyed, and children lived in constant fear. The National Army, despite receiving training from France and other Western powers, struggled to adapt to guerrilla warfare tactics used by the jihadists. What frustrated Ibrahim most was the disconnect between the government and the military. Politicians in Ouagadougou made grand speeches about defeating terrorism, while soldiers on the ground lacked basic equipment and supplies. Some units went weeks without proper food rations, while others ran out of ammunition during crucial operations. The gap between political promises and battlefield reality was growing wider every day. During this period, Ibrahim began building a network of like-minded officers who shared his concerns about the country's direction. These were not ambitious politicians seeking personal power, but dedicated soldiers who had sworn to protect their nation and its people. They met in small groups discussing military strategy and the need for new leadership that understood the realities of modern warfare. The breaking point came in January 2022, when a particularly devastating terrorist attack killed dozens of civilians in a northern village. The government's response was predictably weak, more calls for international assistance and empty promises of reform. Ibrahim and his allies decided that enough was enough. If the current leadership could not protect Burkina Faso's people, then new leadership was needed. Planning a military takeover required careful coordination and absolute secrecy. Ibrahim's engineering background proved invaluable, as he developed detailed plans for securing key government buildings, communication centers, and military installations. Every aspect of the operation was meticulously planned, from timing to logistics to post-coup governance structures. On the night of January 23, 2022, Ibrahim's plan went into action. Elite military units moved swiftly to secure strategic locations across Ouagadougou. The presidential palace was surrounded before dawn, and key government officials were placed under protective custody. The operation was conducted with minimal violence, reflecting Ibrahim's commitment to avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. By morning, President Traoré had been removed from power, and the patriotic movement for safeguard and restoration had taken control of the government. Ibrahim emerged as the leader of this movement, though he initially remained in the background, preferring to let the military council speak collectively. This humility surprised many observers who expected typical power-hungry coup leaders. The international reaction was swift and predictable. France, the former colonial power, condemned the coup and threatened sanctions. The United States and European Union issued stern statements about democratic backsliding in West Africa. The African Union suspended Burkina Faso's membership, following established protocols for countries where governments are changed through non-democratic means. However, the domestic reaction told a different story. Thousands of Burkinabe citizens took to the streets of Ouagadougou, not to protest the coup but to celebrate it. They waved national flags and chanted slogans supporting the new military leadership. Many carried signs demanding an end to French influence in their country. The popular support caught international observers off guard, revealing the deep frustration with the previous government's performance. Ibrahim understood that military coups alone do not solve complex problems. He immediately began implementing practical reforms aimed at improving security and governance. Military units were reorganized and re-equipped with better weapons and communication systems. New tactical approaches were developed specifically for countering guerrilla warfare in the Sahel environment. The new leadership also began reviewing all international agreements and partnerships. Ibrahim was particularly skeptical of arrangements that gave foreign powers significant influence over Burkina Faso's domestic and foreign policies. He believed that true sovereignty required the ability to make independent decisions about national security, economic development, and diplomatic relations. As news of the coup spread across Africa, Ibrahim began receiving messages of support from unexpected sources. Military officers in other West African countries expressed admiration for his courage in challenging failed leadership. Young people across the continent saw him as a symbol of African self-determination and resistance to foreign domination. Ibrahim Traoré was beginning to emerge as more than just another military leader. He was becoming a continental figure. The dusty streets of Bondoukoui village in Burkina Faso were quiet on the day Ibrahim Traoré was born in 1988. His mother held her newborn son close, unaware that this child would one day shake the entire continent of Africa. The village was small, with mud brick houses scattered along dirt roads that turned to rivers during the rainy season. Life here moved slowly, just as it had for generations. Ibrahim's father worked hard to feed his family, doing whatever jobs he could find in their rural community. His mother sold vegetables in the local market, counting every franc to make sure her children had enough to eat. The Traoré family was not wealthy, but they were rich in values that would shape young Ibrahim's character forever. As a boy, Ibrahim was different from other children in his village. While other kids played games in the dust, he often sat quietly, watching and listening to the adults talk about their problems. The villagers complained about corrupt officials who demanded bribes for basic services. They whispered about politicians who promised everything during elections, but delivered nothing afterward. Young Ibrahim absorbed every word. School was a luxury in Bondoukoui, but Ibrahim's parents sacrificed everything to send him. The classroom was a small concrete building with no electricity, where students shared books and wrote on pieces of cardboard when paper ran out. Despite these challenges, Ibrahim excelled in his studies. His teachers noticed something special about him, a sharp mind that could solve complex problems and a natural ability to lead other students. During his teenage years, Ibrahim witnessed events that would forever change his worldview. Foreign mining companies arrived in nearby areas, promising jobs and development for local communities. Instead, they brought environmental destruction and exploitation. The companies hired security forces who treated local people like criminals on their own land. Ibrahim watched his neighbors become poorer, while foreign executives got richer from Burkina Faso's natural resources. The young man also saw how international aid organizations operated in his country. Well-meaning foreigners arrived with expensive vehicles and stayed in comfortable hotels, while distributing small amounts of aid to desperate communities. Ibrahim began to question why Africa, despite its vast mineral wealth and hard-working people, remained dependent on handouts from other continents. These experiences planted seeds of revolutionary thinking in Ibrahim's mind. He started reading everything he could find about African history, learning how colonial powers had carved up the continent for their own benefit. He discovered stories of African leaders who had fought for true independence, only to be overthrown or assassinated when they threatened foreign interests. Education became Ibrahim's weapon of choice. He pursued engineering studies, believing that technical knowledge would help him serve his country better. During his university years, he met other young Africans who shared his vision of a truly independent continent. They formed study groups where they discussed political theory, economic systems, and military strategy. The more Ibrahim learned, the more frustrated he became with Burkina Faso's leadership. President Roch Kabore's government seemed unable to protect its citizens from increasing terrorist attacks. Jihadist groups were spreading across the Sahel region, killing civilians and displacing entire communities. The National Army appeared powerless to stop the violence, despite receiving training and equipment from foreign powers. Ibrahim watched as his country's security situation deteriorated year after year. Villages were abandoned as families fled terrorist attacks. Young people saw no future in their homeland and risked dangerous journeys to reach Europe. The government's response was always the same, asking for more international assistance and promising reforms that never materialized. This deteriorating situation pushed Ibrahim toward a military career. He believed that only through strength could Burkina Faso protect its people and assert its independence. His engineering background made him valuable to the armed forces, where he quickly gained respect for his technical skills and innovative thinking. Fellow soldiers were drawn to his quiet confidence and clear vision for their country's future. As Ibrahim rose through military ranks, he never forgot his humble origins in Bondoukoui village. He remained connected to ordinary Burkinabe people, understanding their daily struggles and dreams. This connection would prove crucial in the years to come, as Ibrahim prepared to challenge not just his country's leadership, but the entire system that kept Africa dependent on foreign powers. The sun was setting over Ouagadougou as Ibrahim Traoré stood on the balcony of the presidential palace, looking out at the city that had transformed during his leadership. The streets below buzzed with activity, vendors selling local products, students walking to evening classes, and families enjoying the security that had returned to their lives. The sight filled him with quiet satisfaction, but also with the weight of responsibility for maintaining and expanding the changes he had initiated. 3 years after taking power, Ibrahim had achieved something that many observers had thought impossible. Burkina Faso had become a symbol of African possibility, demonstrating that the continent's problems were not insurmountable when addressed with competent leadership and genuine commitment to the people's welfare. The transformation had inspired similar movements across Africa and changed how the world viewed African political capacity. The military victories against terrorism had been perhaps the most visible success. Burkina Faso's armed forces, once considered among the weakest in the region, had become a model for other African militaries. The combination of improved training, better equipment, and tactics adapted to local conditions had produced dramatic results. Terrorist groups that had once operated freely in northern regions had been pushed back or eliminated entirely. More importantly, the security improvements had allowed displaced populations to return to their homes and resume normal lives. Schools that had been closed for years reopened with full enrollment. Markets that had been abandoned because of security concerns were again bustling with commerce. The psychological impact of restored security was as valuable as any economic development program. Ibrahim's economic policies had fundamentally altered Burkina Faso's relationship with the global economy. Instead of simply exporting raw materials and importing finished goods, the country had begun developing processing capabilities that created value-added products from its natural resources. Gold mining operations now included local refining, facilities that employed thousands of Burkinabe workers and generated significantly more revenue for the national treasury. The renegotiated contracts with foreign companies had become a template for other African countries, seeking more equitable arrangements with international investors. Ibrahim's insistence that foreign businesses share profits fairly and transfer technology to local partners had proven that African countries could maintain beneficial relationships with international companies without accepting exploitative terms. Educational transformation had been equally dramatic. The curriculum in schools and universities had been revised to include more African history, languages, and technical subjects relevant to national development. Students were learning about continental heroes like Thomas Sankara and Julius Nyerere, alongside global historical figures. This cultural revival was building a generation of young people who understood their heritage and possibilities. Ibrahim's influence had spread far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Military leaders across Africa studied his methods and sought his advice on governance and security issues. Democratic leaders who had initially criticized his rise to power began adopting elements of his policies, recognizing their effectiveness in addressing persistent problems that traditional approaches had failed to solve. The international community had been forced to recalibrate its approach to engaging with African countries. The failure of sanctions and isolation to weaken Ibrahim's government had demonstrated that African leaders with genuine popular support could maintain independence even when facing pressure from major powers. This realization was encouraging other African leaders to adopt more assertive positions in international negotiations. Regional cooperation had become one of Ibrahim's most significant achievements. The alliance between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea had evolved into a broader West African confederation that coordinated policies on security, trade, and development. This cooperation was creating economies of scale that allowed smaller countries to compete more effectively in global markets while maintaining their political independence. The cultural impact of Ibrahim's leadership extended throughout the African diaspora. Young people of African descent in the Americas and Europe began studying his speeches and policies as examples of successful African leadership. The psychological effect of seeing a young African leader successfully challenging established international hierarchies was inspiring pride and ambition among millions of people worldwide. Ibrahim understood that his personal legacy was less important than the institutional changes he had initiated. He had begun developing systems and structures that would ensure continuity of his policies even after he eventually stepped down from leadership. Constitutional reforms were being drafted that would prevent future governments from abandoning the principles of sovereignty and self-reliance that had defined his administration. The young leader also recognized that sustainable transformation required broad-based participation rather than dependence on individual leadership. He had worked to strengthen civil society organizations, labor unions, and professional associations that could maintain pressure for good governance regardless of who held political power. This institutional development was crucial for long-term democratic stability. As Ibrahim reflected, on the journey from his humble origins in Bondokui village to his current position as one of Africa's most influential leaders, he remained focused on the future rather than past achievements. The continent still faced enormous challenges that would require sustained effort from multiple generations of leaders. His role had been to demonstrate that change was possible and to inspire others to continue. The work of African liberation and development, the transformation of Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré's leadership had proven that Africa's problems were not the result of inevitable cultural or geographic factors, but of poor leadership and exploitative international relationships. His example showed that competent, committed leadership could achieve rapid improvements in security, economic development, and national pride. Most importantly, his success had inspired a new generation of African leaders who understood that their continent's destiny was in their own hands.